Thanks for joining us. This is our July edition of the Marks Group, Crystal Reports, Tips, and Tricks webinars. We put on these tips and tricks webinars about once a month. This month, we're talking about a couple of different things. We're talking about how to calculate age, how to express the age in days. One of the nice things about Crystal is that once you start dealing with data types, doing things like calculating age becomes very, very easy and, in fact, a little fun. We're going to look at subtotaling formulas, why you should total formulas and not raw database values. We're going to look at parameters also with multiple values, and we're going to see how to pull those multiple values out of any given parameter. So let's go ahead and jump right in and calculate some age. What we have here is our standard training report. Nothing fancy to see here. I do have one group defined. I'm going to go ahead and delete that bad boy. Again, to delete a group, all you have to do is find that group within your sections here on the left-hand side, right-click, and delete group. Yes, we're very sure. Very good. So right now, all we really have is a bunch of contacts and create ons. The create on date is important to our lesson because it is a date time type. Now, the reason we know this is because within Crystal, if I right-click upon that object, I can right-click and go to Format Field. I know that it's a data type because I have this special date time tab available to me here, which lets me select my favorite date format. Thusly, you'll notice here when I right-click and hit formatting on the contact field being just a simple, stupid string, there are no special numerical or date formatting options. So again, it's very important to have that date as a date type. Now, there are things in Crystal that you can do with a formula to convert strings to dates. We're not going to cover that today. That can get a little tricky, to be honest with you. But now that we do have our date on the report and formatted happily, how do we calculate the age? How much time has passed since that date? Now, the easiest way is to actually create a formula. Let's go ahead and create a formula. And just move my coffee. And we're going to call this FRM record age. Oh, looks like I already did this once. Just bear with me, guys. Okay, so again, we want to keep in mind what we're trying to do. We're trying to calculate the number of days that have passed between the create on date of the record and today. Now, the way we return the current date in Crystal is to simply use the current date function. Now, I know if that's a function because it turns blue when I type it in my function editor here, my formula editor. Of course, it is available here within your function tree underneath date time and or date ranges. So we have current time, current date time, current date just returns the date. So what I want to do is take today and subtract that create on date. Now, whenever you're doing any kind of date math, whenever you're doing any kind of subtraction, you always want to obviously subtract the lesser value from the greater. And in the case of dates, today and anything in the future is always greater than anything before today and in the past. So if I go ahead and hit the syntax checker on that, no errors found. I love to see that. We'll go ahead and save and use that. And again, whenever you're working with formulas in Crystal, it always helps to drag that formula right next to the record, or right next to the field, rather, that it's operating with or on. Okay, so right here that we can see that it is calculating days. A lot of these records are honestly very old, so we're getting some very big numbers. So you'll see here that the default calculation returns itself in number of days. Let's go ahead and hit the formatting on that, and we'll remove the decimal points. And there we are. So very easily, we're able to calculate the number of days that have passed since any database date. This is most often used in the scenario of like a 30, 60, 90 days report. Very, very easy to do because now that we have our record age value, this is now a bona fide Crystal object within our report and is therefore available for any kind of formulas or calculations or any kind of selection expert criteria we want to experiment with. So one of the easiest things that we can do is actually, let's group these records together. Let's be a little fancy. We'll group these records together, and what we'll say, let me just get a look at here, what kind of records we have. Let's cut them into two groups. I want all records created within the last 90 days and everybody else. How do we do that? Again, we're going to start with a brand new formula. I'm going to call this my age bucket. Ooh, caps lock, not your friend. Okay, so the idea behind the age bucket is to bucket records depending upon the number of days old they are. So we're going to use a bunch of if-then-elses. And again, if-then-elses are your friend in Crystal. So again, the idea is to say if something is true, then do something. Otherwise, do something else. So if my record age is less than or equal to 90, then we're going to call it something. Then we're going to say 90 days. Else, very old. And before I put my foot in my mouth, let me check that syntax. Very good, no errors found. Okay, so if our record age is less than or equal to 90, then we give it this 90 days. So when we say then something, all this formula is going to be doing is just returning a string, in this case 90 days. Anything else will return as very old. Let's go ahead and take a peek at how that looks. Before we group upon this, we're actually going to add it to the report. We just want to kind of eyeball what's going on here with our formula. It's always a good idea to kind of get just an idea of what's going on. Yeah, okay, so there are a few in here. 90 days or less, very good. All right, so now that we have our record, Control Z, always your friend to undo. Now that we have our record age in days, and depending upon the age in days, we have our bucket calculation. Now we can actually insert a group under my insert menu. And I want to insert a group based upon age bucket. There we are. And now we have our two buckets. We have our 90 days and our very old. And that works as you would expect it to. Now, if we wanted to get even fancier, we could re-edit that age bucket formula, and we can even add a second or third category. So we can say, if it's 90 or less, then say it's 90 days. Otherwise, if it's greater than or equal to 90 and less than or equal to 120, then we're going to call it 90 to 120 days. Oh. Let me check my syntax. Looks good. Okay, so now what's happening is that we're doing our 90 days calculation as we were before, but then we're doing one more level. We're saying otherwise, if the record is greater than or equal to 90 and it's less than or equal to 120, then give it this designation. Otherwise, again, we're going to call it very old. And to have that last else there is very, very important, because you need to have that catch-all. Otherwise, if you come up with records that perhaps don't fall into your buckets, they're going to not appear on the report, and it might be a little confusing as to what's going on. So it's always good to have that final else. And you can even say that final else could be just an unknown, just so they stick out on the record, let's say. We'll stick with very old. Let's go ahead and look at how that operates. Very good. And now we have three groups, because we're already grouping by the formula. The formula has added a third unique value, and Crystal is automatically going to use that to cut out the third portion of the bucket. So that's calculating age. Good stuff. Let's move on to subtotaling formulas. What do I mean by that? Well, the first thing I want to do is go ahead and delete my group. And I want to remove these guys from my report, get my clean list of folks back. And what I want to do here is, let's see, let's insert a couple of other fields to differentiate these people. Let's insert state. Never saw a state name so long as that. Let's go ahead and shrink that up. Best ways to use my arrow keys to move stuff around here. Let's just take a peek. I'm guessing a lot of these people don't have states, but some certainly should. Some do. So let's go ahead and we'll actually only return the records that have states. So we'll add that to our selection expert. We'll say state. And not be blank. Okay, so now we have here just a bunch of records with a state. So the idea is to total formulas and not database records. What do I really mean by this? Well, the task before us is to actually subtotal the number of people per state. Now, what you might be inclined to do here is actually insert a group upon state. So we cut out our state buckets here. And then what we might also be tempted to do is insert just a simple summary. In this case, primary key on the back end, which in this case, in Goldline's case, and what that's going to do is just give us a simple subtotal of people per state. Now, and that's easy, and that's actually a pretty good way to do your totals in Crystal, because now that we have our total object, the act of moving this total object between sections actually affects how that's calculated. So now it's a grand total. Now that I moved it to the report footer, that is now a grand report total. If I move it back to the group footer, it becomes a group total again. Certainly, we can have it both places. That was just a control click to copy that object. That works with any Crystal object. If I just control click drag, I'll just copy it over. So if I copy that, now we have both. And that kind of really wants to like a simple list. How many people in each state? Now, what you could do, you report here. What we might actually want to do is suppress the details section, and what that will do is that will only result in our subtotals. And again, now we're actually getting into the realm, in my humble opinion, of messiness. This is actually becoming a poor design, because if the boss ever wants to see the detail records, he's going to have to know enough to go under the report design and right-click and don't suppress and re-preview, and we typically don't want the boss to do things like that. So how do we accomplish this in a different way, a slightly different way? Let's go ahead and remove these subtotals, and we're actually going to remove our group. There we are. Okay, so we're actually going to use a set of formulas. Let's go ahead and start creating them. My first formula is going to be, let me just go ahead and delete that. So very busy. Okay. I call this formula New York records. The idea is to, for every record in the report, perform a little test, and if that record is a New York record, then return me a 1. Otherwise, return me a 0. This is actually a lot more clever than it seems. So again, we're going to fall back on our good old buddy if then else. If my state is equal to New York, double quote in Crystal, if my state is equal to New York, then 1, else 0. And we're going to go ahead and create another formula for PA records. Kind of the same deal. If my state is equal to Pennsylvania, then 1, otherwise 0. Why are we doing this? Let's go ahead and drag those onto the report, and we'll see what they're going to do for us. All right, so what the formula is really doing is just, and that decimal precision really bugs me, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. What this is doing, obviously, is returning a 1 or a 0, depending upon the calculation, the condition within the formula itself. So in this case, for North Carolina and Arizona, it returns a 0 for both columns, because obviously they do not belong in either Pennsylvania or New York. So now what it's actually very, very easy to do is just subtotal these columns, right? So if I just insert a summary, and I want to select my brand new snazzy fields, my New York records, and I want to sum, and move that down to the report footer. Let's test that before I put my foot in my mouth, and there we go. I'm going to go ahead and remove that group header that seems to mess up the report just a little bit. And here we are. There's our 7 New York. And then we're going to go ahead and subtotal again for our PA records. Insert a summary based upon PA records. And again, we want it to be the sum. And we'll move that down. So now what we have, let's go ahead and remove the decimal places on that bad boy. Oh, so good. All right, so what we have here is a very easy way to count records in the report. And the nice way about this approach is that you have the ability to leave all the record detail intact on the report and on the page. So you don't have to do things like suppress sections and work with groups and grouping too awfully much to get this result. The biggest reason why you'd probably want to do it this way is because the report is going to have both New York and Pennsylvania records on it. So we want to be able to total both of those unique situations. The more vanilla approach would be to actually filter the report for just New York records, get your subtotal that way, and then run it again and filter by PA records and then get your subtotal that way. In this case, this is actually a better approach for, let's say, if you wanted to have a more complex counting criteria here. Like you could say, I mean, obviously because this calculation is a formula, the sky's the limit. So it could be as complex as if the record is in New York and they're a prospect and Bob is the account manager, then return a 1. Otherwise, return a 0. So instead of counting just a simple thing about the database, we're actually performing a really clever calculation as the report generates at runtime, which again is a better solution because again, if we ever need to change anything about this calculation, it is as easy as just opening up the report and editing the underlying formula, and then all of the subtotals will naturally follow that modification to your base underlying formula. So this is actually a better way to design a report for longevity. You always want to think about that future maintenance that the boss is always going to want. Guarantee that. Let's go ahead and move on to parameters with multiple values. One of my personal favorites. Let's go ahead and remove this stuff. Even though it's shrunk up, we still have a group here. We're going to go ahead and delete that. Very good. Okay, so the idea is going to be to create a parameter for this report to only return records where the create on is between a set of dates. This is a very, very typical thing to do with a crystal report. Let's go ahead and start. We'll go ahead and insert our parameter. Just bear with me one moment. That's all right. I'll just go ahead and make a new one. We're going to call this my... And whenever I create my parameter fields, you always want to make sure that the name is the actual underlying crystal name. The prompting text is obviously what the end user sees. So you just want to be mindful of that when you name these things. I'm going to call this P date range. And my prompting text will be select a date range. And because this is a date range, we want to make sure that we select our date value type here. And we also want to make sure to select range values. So what this parameter is going to do is now prompt us for a starting and ending date to use in our selection criteria. Of course, it's not going to start doing that until we actually include it within our select criteria. So right now it's not being used, it doesn't really care what it is, so Crystal's smart enough to not bother us with it. If I go into my select expert here, go into my formula editor, let's go ahead and remove our state condition, and we'll say my create on date needs to be somewhere in my parameter of date range. Now, this is one of the great things about doing ranged parameters in Crystal is because it allows you to use this in operator. Otherwise, what you would actually end up doing is creating two parameters, a starting date and an ending date, and then you could actually structure your select criteria to be the create on should be greater than or equal to my start date, and it should be less than, or I'm sorry, it should be greater than or equal to our start date. That would make much more sense. And it needs to be less than or equal to our ending date. But then you have two dates here in the mix. And it can make your formulas unwieldy and needlessly complicated. It's a much better solution to use the in operator here. So my create date needs to be in my date range. Check my syntax, it is just that easy. So now when I preview my report, it is now prompting me to plug in some values into this parameter. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and actually, because I recall that my records are pretty darned old at this point, let's make it 2012 to 2014. And there we are. Let's go ahead and remove these because I'm not sure what they're doing, to be honest with you. Okay, very good. So that's how you use a ranged parameter. Now, one of the biggest things you're going to want to do once you start using parameters within your Crystal report is to actually insert those parameters on the report. You want the end user, when they choose to print this report, to be comfortable with the values that they selected. You want them to be mindful of them. So let's go ahead and drag our date range onto the report. Now what that does for us is absolutely nothing. Because that parameter is a ranged parameter, it does make it impossible to simply drag it onto the report like you would be able to pretty much any other Crystal object. Now we have to be a little trickier with it. So what we actually have to do is, instead of just putting the parameter on the page like that, we're going to create a brand new formula. Formulas everywhere. Now I'm going to call this my range text. And what we're going to do here is actually we're going to use two separate functions, the minimum and the maximum function, to pull the starting and ending date out of that range respectively. So the minimum function, and when I pass my parameter to it, let's go ahead and just leave it just like that for now. That is going to pull out, or should pull out rather, the first part of my range. And there it is. Okay, so now if I go back in and re-edit the formula, and we're going to get even fancier. Let's do this. Can I do it this way? Will it get mad with me? Just bear with me, guys. And then the corresponding idea is take the maximum to get the maximum range out. Now, won't let me concatenate because it's returning date values, so let's not get hung up on that. So we'll just leave this as it is, our range text. And actually what we'll do is we'll rename that to date begin. And we'll make a new formula for date end. And again, we're going to use our maximum function to pull the top end range out of that date value. So now we have a date end. And now it's fairly easy to put a little 2 here. If I had more time, I'd show you guys how to actually just return this all as one formula with the 2 in there as well. But you need to convert the dates to string. Otherwise, it thinks you're trying to do date math. Again, arrow keys are your friend in Crystal. And there we are. And you can kind of clean that up a little bit, but you get the idea. But again, the using the parameter of a range parameter gives you really cool abilities, like the ability to use this in operator within your formula editor. But it does come at the cost of ease of use, because then you're not able to simply drag that value to your report. You actually have to screw around with a couple of other formulas to grab out the top and bottom value out of that range. And that will just about take up our time for today. I'd like to thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Of course, I'm always looking for that next batch of Crystal Reports, tips, and tricks, so please feel free to email me at justin@markstroop.net. And thank you so much, and have a great day.